Right now we are going to discuss in the same way with Tom. Tom, he's going to talk about the future of the job and employment. Lyublena, Dimova.
It's hard, don't worry.
Don't worry about that.
But you said it perfect.
So thank you very much for coming to Tenerife. So I know that you are very busy agenda, so it's fantastic you stay here. So go ahead, and thank you very much to be here.
Yes, thank you very much to all organizers. It's a great pleasure to be here. Just so you know, our session is called Labor Challenges in Tourism. But don't trust the program, because I'm going to talk about something else. And as an association, as an international association, I would like to also share our priorities and some interesting trends that it's good to keep an eye on over the next years. But before that, just for those that are less familiar with the European Travel Commission, we are an international association which represents the national tourism organizations across Europe. And we are working very hard towards improving the sustainable development of Europe, about advocating the importance of tourism for the European society, for the European economy, and also we are promoting Europe as a tourism destination. And to stay relevant to our members and to the whole ecosystem, we pay close attention on what's happening around us, because we want to impact the way tourism forms, because we are firm believers that it's better to put our hands and formulate the future rather than trying to forecast it. And of course, to try to shape it, you need clear vision. So here, just very briefly, these are our wants for the European tourism in the next years. So we want Europe to be the most sustainable destination. We want tourism to be a leading force for this sustainable transformation. We want tourism to be an essential part of each country's development. And very importantly, we want to keep the rights of people to travel free, but in a responsible way that benefits everybody. So how do we do that? There are just 3 areas that we are focused on. We have a very ambitious program of work related to promotion, to advocacy, and knowledge generations. And all of these areas are taking into account what has been already said about the principles for the future. And since I come from a research background, I will put a little bit more attention on that. And I will focus my presentation on 2 topics that I find very interesting and very relevant, because we will not get rid of them over the next years. And I'm not saying that these are the most important topics in total. No, there are also other ones, but we have limited time. I also want you to have your coffee on time, so I'll just follow on these 2. And they're pretty broad anyways, so yeah, let's kick off. One is travelers' behavior. Obviously, this is something that can be impacted by internal amount of variables. But I decided to focus on 2. One is the high travel costs, and the other one is the changing weather. So starting with the high travel costs, you know that since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, prices specifically for tourism-related products were 30% higher than in 2019. So for us, it was very interesting to understand how European travelers will react to these kind of changes. So for 2 years, we've been asking them, in the context of inflation, are you planning to spend your budget differently? And what we found consistently is that the way people perceive travel is the same way they perceive everyday essentials, like food, like energy and fuel. As you can see here on the graph, the majority of people didn't plan to reduce their spending on travel, and some of them even plan to increase it. So if we take a step backward, what that tells us is that, especially in the European context, travel is becoming more and more a commodity rather than anything else. It's a necessity. It's not a luxury. It's part of our lives. And of course, I'm not trying to say that travel costs are not impacting travelers. It does impact them. People, I'll just get back to that. It does impact them, but not in a way that they will give up. They just become more flexible and more creative about their traveling. So here are just a few examples of how people decided to apply tactics to cut some costs before reaching their destinations. We have a lot of people looking for off-seasonal travel. We have people looking for more affordable destinations, booking early activities, packing light, buying going for more low-cost tickets. Within the destination, we saw that many people are just to be able to enjoy their vacation, just cutting off a little bit on shopping activities, going to less expensive restaurants, using more public transportation, which is great. A lot of people also turned into the all-inclusive offers as well, because this helped them to understand the final cost of the trips that they are going on. So as you can see, some of these changes were actually very positive in terms of tourism in Europe. So off-seasonal travel, the use of public transportation, even the low-cost flights, because if you look at the CO emission generated by low-cost flights, they're usually between point A and point B, rather than with a lot of transfers and so on. So people just fly to a destination where they can reach, directly. But we cannot always expect that travelers will be that flexible and take responsible choices. And just to give you an example as well, these are the latest results of our inter-European travel research. And on the screen, you see the places where people want to go. So the majority of Europeans plan to travel within Europe. And if you have a look at the breakdown, more than 50% plan to travel either domestically or to a neighboring country. And that implies, in general, not very long distance of travel. It's rather short haul to mid haul. And although the distance is not big, air travel remains the #1 preferred transportation. And it actually hit the record height since we started this survey back in 2000, just a little bit before the pandemic. And of course, we don't want to spend our time on the road. We want to just take a plane, get to the destination. But there is also other thing. There is much more availability of air tickets in general, but also to book in advance. And they're also much more affordable. And I know that sounds a little bit strange because flight tickets have been super expensive lately. But just to be a little bit more illustrative, Greenpeace has conducted a research last summer to compare the air fares and the rail fares between European destinations. They analyzed 112 routes between European destinations. For 79 of these routes, the flight tickets were cheaper. So what I'm trying to say here is that when we have our discussions on how industry is turning into more sustainable and we are expecting travelers to take responsible choices, we have to take this kind of information in consideration. That's just one example, but we cannot ask people to buy more expensive things for less convenience and less comfort. Now, other than prices, I already mentioned, weather is something that will continue consistently impacting travelers' behavior. I just want to bring you back to last summer, which was very hot. If you have forgotten, I've taken out 3 days for you to bring you back. 3 days in 3 destinations. So we have Italy, July 18, 43 degrees. We have Greece, July 23rd, 46. We have France, August 23rd, 42. Can you imagine traveling to one of these destinations being there on one of these days? Let me tell you, you will probably wake up, go to the beach at 6 in the morning, come back at 10:30, and stay at your hotel room until 5, 6, just to be safe. Or maybe you'll be brave and you'll go out, and maybe you will dehydrate, maybe you will faint. It's not what it's supposed to be, and it's also not pleasant for the workers in the destination. And because of that, and because of the floods that we had, and because of the wildfires, people actually started last year to really be worried about the extreme weather events in the destination they plan to visit. And they start considering the weather as a criteria, it was the #1 criteria for them to choose destination. And then a year later, we are summer 2024, we investigate if people plan to travel to summer, and the sentiment to travel is even higher than last year. And the surprise here, actually it's not a surprise, July and August are again the most popular months. So what is happening here and what does that tell us? First of all, it tells us that people's memory, at least so far, about the weather conditions is not long-lived. And people are adjusting their travel behavior more when there is a price change rather than there is a weather change, at least for the moment, I repeat. But it also tells us that this is our own fault. Why July and August? Just think about it. We all want to go on holiday, maybe in July and August because it's more quiet. We don't want to go back home receiving 1,000 emails, right? You want a peaceful summer that you will not regret after that. Maybe also because your kids have school holidays at that time and you want to enjoy with them. Maybe also because the supply side is at full capacity. You have more tickets for planes, you have more tickets for activities within the destination, everything, basically. And in fact, even if you look at the festivals, how they're distributed within Europe across the months of the year, 80% are probably between June and August. 301 events I was checking a few weeks ago are taking place just between June and August. Of course, people will travel at that time, and if we don't change something, nothing will change. If nothing changes, nothing changes. And while July and August were good months in the past, we have to think about how to change this system in the future. One part is obviously the government of destination. Other part is us as tourism destination, tourism businesses, to start educating travelers about the possibilities that Europe presents. And this is specifically important for travelers that come to Europe from outside Europe because they're not so familiar with the weather conditions here. So just to give you an example, my colleagues from marketing, I'm very actually impressed by the way they try to change the narrative. The European Travel Commission will be launching some series of campaigns over the next months together with European destination, just to try to explain people that if they take responsible travel decisions in that account of season travel, consumption of local products, taking a public transportation, and also going off the beaten path, they will receive an unexpected upgrade to their travel. Just here 2 examples. That's an example for Greece. So it reads, for faster access to the Acropolis, try Athens in fall. Another one from Lisbon, Porto, sorry. Take the metro in Porto for exclusive views over Dom Luís Bridge. You know, like we show them how they can actually really enjoy more and receive more in return. And this also improves, obviously, our reputation as a continent, as a destination, because we're in this game together and we have the same challenges together. Now, moving to the second part of my presentation, that's crisis and tourism. Why did I choose this? Because the number of crises over the past years have, if not tripled, maybe doubled, and they are becoming more diverse, they are becoming stronger. And although travelers' demand is very resilient and actually comes back very quickly, that doesn't mean the supply side is that resilient and that we are ready to withstand all kinds of crises. I don't need to, of course, tell you what kind of crisis happened. All the extreme events, all the geopolitical tensions like riots, protests. We have also the technology that helps us a lot, but it also leads to some failures from time to time. Let me see, yes, like these are many different types of cases. And what is the common determinant here is that these crises, no matter what type, they always put us in the same situation. We always, all of a sudden, realize how connected we are with all sectors. But it's too late, obviously. We have to think about it in advance. And then all other consequences come. People and tourists are put at risk. But biodiversity at the destinations is put at risk. There are some clashes among locals and residents. There is economic risk. There is a labor crisis, which we have a great expert here to elaborate on that as well. And the list goes on and goes on about these impacts that crisis can create. But this list, it's not endless. There have been a lot of crises, and we know the type of effects. So we have to prepare. We really, like, if not now, I don't know when is the right time, because crises will not stop today, and they will not stop in the next 5 years, and maybe actually we are moving probably to the biggest climate crisis in a couple of years, unfortunately. And assumptions like certain countries or type of destinations are immune to certain type of incidents, it's absolutely wrong. It's absolutely wrong. There is no such kind of thing anymore. Because if that was a reality, who would have guessed that we'll see Dubai airport like that a few months ago, right? This is just one example. There are lots of examples across the world. And besides crisis becoming stronger and very unexpected, there are also a few things that are happening almost for any type of crisis that for us it's very good to consider as manager of businesses or destinations. So we live in a constant communication on society. And that means that when incidents happen, it's very likely that it will get to the news before it gets to you. Here is one example from Southwest Flight 1318, which happened in 2018. And unfortunately, the engine of this plane broke. There was one fatality, and they also had to land urgently. And the picture that you see is actually taken from another passenger from another plane, streamlining the situation and commenting on it. So we don't have the golden hour that was out there in the past, where, let's say, your business has to get together and collect the right information and give it to the media to prepare. We don't have that. We have to be faster and more creative. Another thing is that, as I said, technology helps us a lot. But for instance, that's, of course, just one example. AI will increasingly test our ability to judge what's real and what's not. This is always very important to keep an eye on. Here is just an example of the pension reform in France, and this picture went on social media about older person being beaten by the police. This was absolutely wrong, but you can imagine what kind of sentiment it created in social media. So, yeah, let's be a little bit more conscious about these things, because crises are happening and the context around crises is also changing, making everything much more complicated than it used to be. Now, finally, is tourism to blame itself? Of course not. It's not our fault, all the crises on this world. But we have to take an ownership about several things. Irresponsible visitor behavior can trigger incidents. Also, sometimes people just come unprepared and they can provoke an incident, let's say. There are unlicensed businesses that can put visitors in danger, that can create an incident which evolves into a crisis after that. And then sometimes tourism facilities are poorly built. So this is our fault. And just to finish, I find this statement actually very important. When the sustainability of tourism itself is being questioned, the blame for incidents can quickly turn residents against visitors. And residents and visitors are the most important assets that we have for our industry. So at the European Travel Commission, we are currently developing a framework related to crisis and management. We'll be very happy to share it with all of you, because there will be a lot of examples, a lot of guidelines, and I'll finish actually my presentation here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm glad to receive any questions.
Thank you, Lyublena, for your brilliant presentation. You are giving us, many tips. So education again, social education again. So for the academia, we have a lot of questions to research in terms of that. Solution for these questions, so new tips and new, topics to analyze. So education training also. And right now, Tom is going to talk about the job and employment. So, are you okay?
Yeah, we are.
Yeah.
We're perfect.
So if you look, the idea is to have a version of the professional part, and technical part, and right now it's academia. So that's the message that we want to translate of a participant. There's a necessity to work coordinating and collaborating, all of us, in terms to have solutions for the tourism in the future. Thank you. Tom, are you okay?
I am perfect.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you. And thank you to our previous speakers for setting me up very nicely in terms of some of the ideas and some of the thoughts that we need to address. When Eduardo asked me to talk about the future of work or human resources in tourism, I thought, gosh, again, because this is a question that's being asked constantly, and since the last crisis, since the pandemic, it's something which has become has moved up the agenda for a lot of organizations in the public sector, businesses in the private sector again. What will work look like? How can we shape our businesses? How can we shape our tourism industries to reflect changes, social changes, economic changes, wider digital changes that are taking place in society, and establish what the future of work will look like? Now, of course, I'm not a futurologist. I can't read the future. I haven't got a magic wand that will tell me what the future looks like. If you want a sense of that, our colleague in academia, Ian Yeoman, talks about the future constantly. And what I love about people who talk about the future is nobody comes back to them in 10 years' time and says, you were wrong. It didn't happen that way. They're never held accountable. So it's one of as academics, people who look to the future have some of the greatest freedoms going. But I've been doing this for a long, long time. I've been doing this longer than many of you in this room have been on this planet. So that's worrying. I started out looking at tourism employment from a policy, from a governmental and from a enterprise point of view, 42 years ago now? Okay. And therefore, I look at that history and I reflect on that history. And in many ways, that's very important to me because I think one of the things that I have learned, and I'll point out, is that yes, things change, but yes, things don't change. And I think that's one of the challenges we have in this area. My starting point, whenever I think about this topic, goes back to one of my favorite books by George Orwell, who, of course, the English social commentator who had strong links to Spain in his time as well. And in one of his less celebrated books, he wrote about his experiences of working in different jobs during the Great Depression in the early 1930s. And he worked in restaurants and hotels in Paris. And he raised the issue about the social purpose of some of the work that we ask our colleagues in the business to do. What is the social purpose of the plongeur, the pot wash in Parisian hotels and restaurants? What do they contribute to society through the work that we ask them to do? And I think he was, in doing so, he was reflecting on very challenging working conditions, very inhumane treatment of the most defenseless, the lowest paid, the members of the people working in the industry. And I suppose my question really from that is, well, that was 1933, that's almost 100 years ago now. Have things really changed that dramatically? And if we look at the imagery of the industry over that sort of period, yes, we have colour photography for starters, but we also have a sense that there is a lot which hasn't changed. A lot of the jobs that people do haven't changed significantly. How they do them, how they deliver them, yes, there have been changes. But there's also subtle changes. There's far greater diversity in the workforce. People come from different backgrounds, different ethnicities. Obviously, it's an industry that has embraced and included women to a far greater extent than it would have done 100 years ago. But at the same time, there is a lot that is the same. The hierarchies, the formality, the relationship between guest and employee. And again, looking at the airline industry, we see similar things. Perhaps it's less glamorous than it was in its early days. It was very much seen as glamour work. I would hardly describe working for a low-cost airline in Europe today as glamorous work. It's very hard, very demanding work. So things change, some things don't change. And I think the reality is that tourism work is a world of what you might call complexity and paradox. And that was true 100 years ago. It's true today, and I would venture to say it will be true going forward. It's a diverse sector. One of our challenges talking about tourism work, is that we actually don't really agree on what we're talking about. Even if, reference was made earlier on to data and the need for good data about tourism. Absolutely. But if you then start interrogating data, say on a European or international basis in relation to tourism, you do not get a clear picture. You get very, very different definitions, even of basic job families. So you get situations where in some countries, governments report that over 50% of their tourism workforce is working in accommodation. In other countries, similar economies, similar size, if you like, they report that 11% of their workforce is working in tourism. And what frustrates me as an academic is that that data is used uncritically. So in official government reports or international agency reports, we see this data reproduced. It isn't true. It is fiction. And so for me, that one of the priorities in really understanding the future of work in tourism is to agree what work in tourism is to start with. And we don't have that definitional agreement. So I think that's a huge problem. And agencies need to be much more demanding of their partners, the governments who provide the data, in order to do that. But looking at it more from a different point of view, as well as this sort of understanding the sector, we have issues around that tourism operates in multinational, huge businesses, Marriott, for example, in the hospitality sector, as well as micro, single person operations. So we've got the whole diversity of business size. And the world in one is not the same as the other, obviously. We're talking about businesses that operate in the informal, the traditional, the formal sector, the informal sector, and the emerging gig platform sharing economy, if you like. And again, that's where we're, as academics, as government agencies, we're reluctant to actually accommodate or address the more uncomfortable realities of the informal sector, of the platform sector. We tend then to base our data almost exclusively on the formal reported sector. That only tells a little bit of the picture around tourism. Tourism, we know, is precarious. It lacks security, if you like, and there is high turnover for structural reasons, seasonality in many parts of Spain, in many tourism locations in Europe. And seasonality, in many ways, is one of the biggest structural challenges to tourism employment. If a business is open for 6 months, it cannot employ people for 12 months. It's obvious, and that has huge social consequences. It means that people who work in tourism cannot access if you like, the financial and the social benefits which somebody in a 12-month employment could do. Whether that relates to housing access to housing, whether it relates to access to loans, and to a whole range of other things relating to the participation in civic society. Participating in the electoral process, elections, may be limited because you are transitory, you're moving, you haven't got a fixed address, as we might say. Low pay, and we can talk about pay forever, and I know their colleagues from the industry here, from the tourism industry, and pay is a real challenge. Competing with other sectors, when you're under such competitive pressure, when you're perhaps beholden to third parties, tour operators and the like, is very difficult. And pay is often the ultimate, the one area where we can try to reduce our costs in order to meet the demands. Ultimately, for me, that's a consumer issue. Consumers in Europe, but also elsewhere in the world, are always looking for cheap, 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 cheap. And as long as we do that, we'll be paying our workforce cheap, 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 cheap. It's obvious. And I don't see a resolution to that in the short term. Challenging working conditions, I mean, and this is particularly pertinent in relation to young people, the industry works when they want to and their friends are playing. And that's always been the case, and that is certainly a challenge in relation to what we're doing. But what we do have is we have a high level of transitory, mobile, migrant workers within the industry. In today's Europe, for example, with the political complexion in many countries, that is becoming an issue, and we need to think, tourism needs to think about worst case scenarios if borders were closed and access to additional labour markets were blocked. I think thinking in the future, we need to do so. We're going through an election at the moment in the UK, and our political parties are talking about reskilling those who are currently economically inactive to bring them back into the economy. And that would, in theory, benefit tourism. Whether it can actually happen in practice, I've been looking at schemes like that for a long time. That isn't new particularly. And yes, it can work at the margins. It can't solve the problem, so to speak. And so, yes, there's the low status of work, that's already been mentioned, and the need to make tourism the profession of choice. So I'm going to use UK figures, but the average salary in the tourism hospitality sector, the hospitality particularly in the UK, is £21,000 a year. The national average is around 29,000, 30,000. If you're a graduate from university and you can get a job as an engineer at 50,000 when you graduate, or in hospitality at 15,000, yeah, okay. But it's not only about pay. This conversation isn't only about pay, although pay is important to bear in mind. So there's a lot going on here. There's automation, there's technology, which I'll hopefully come back to. I just wanted to refer back to the first Tourism State-of-the-Art conference, because we produced a 500 or 600 page book, or the Strathclyde, to accompany the conference. That shows it was old technology. You would never do that today. And I think I looked through the table of contents, and I think Professor Bahalis and myself are the only people who contributed to that tome, that book, who are here today. But I wrote a paper. You can't really see it very clearly, but it talks about national human resource policies for tourism. And for me, that's always been hugely important. We're thinking about people in the context of tourism and developing integrative policies around that. So I wrote that, 30 years ago now. But thinking about crises, thinking about what happened after the pandemic, what we saw was a rush of national debate and discussion about the jobs crisis. And most countries in Europe produced some form of a response to the jobs crisis. We saw it in the US, we saw it in Australia, we saw it in New Zealand. And a lot of it was doing exactly the same as I was talking about in that paper in 1994. National campaigns to make tourism a career of choice. Well, I was running those in the Republic of Ireland in 1987, I think. Okay? Challenging misrepresentation of tourism work. We must persuade the public that tourism work is much better than it really is. Is it that much better? I think the reality is, for a lot of people, it is a tough working career. It is fabulous if you're passionate. It is fabulous if it really works for you in the industry. But to talk about misrepresentation, it again is something which I think misses the point. We need to understand why people perceive work the way they do. Promotion of multi-skilling, multitasking. One of the largest hotel companies in the world, in fact, the largest, has just introduced a global program whereby their associates frontline associates will be required to work in different areas of the hotel, in front office, in service, in housekeeping, and they will be mobile workers, multi-skilled across the sector. Duh. That was happening 40 years ago. I remember that Hilton introducing exactly the same approach in the late 1980s. So I think one of the problems in our conceptualization, our thinking about this issue, is that we actually haven't come up with any new ideas. We're actually saying the same old, same old, same old, same old. And that is the problem. The one area where I think there is hope, if you like, is there's wider recognition of what I'd call the wider socioeconomic barriers to that affect tourism work. Impact of tourism employment characteristics on life and citizenship options, as I mentioned, but also areas like housing, and that's one of the big crisis areas. I know it is here in Tenerife, but it's in virtually every tourism destination. Where can tourism workers afford to live while working in the tourism industry? When you're competing with short stay rentals, when you're competing with holiday homes. I mean, there are places in Cornwall in England, seaside towns, where every second door is a short-term let. And you can tell it by the keypads on the door. So access to finance, access to housing, access to education, childcare, transport. My argument here is that if we are to overcome these issues, in planning all the multiple new destinations and projects and resorts that we were told about earlier, we must place them in the context of the availability of wider infrastructure, community infrastructure that will support the workforce, as well as create the destinations and the activities which tourists will do. We can't just leave housing to chance. We can't just leave childcare to chance, because it's a gendered industry. A large number of our workforce are women, and if we don't support their lives and the reality of their lives, they can't work within tourism in the way that we do. Education, etc. I mean, one of the crises that affected all of us a couple of years ago was the start of the war in Ukraine, and many countries in Europe took refugees from Ukraine, many of whom were women with young children. I remember talking to a group of hoteliers in Scotland about this, and they were licking their lips at the thought of all this cheap labour that was suddenly available to them. And I asked them questions about where are you going to accommodate them? How about access to local schools? Can the schools accommodate children who can't speak English? Oh, that's nothing to do with us. We provide the jobs. But then who else is going to do the joined-up thinking in terms of the other areas? So there's a lot going on, and one of the things that we've been trying to do as scholars, as academics, is to research these areas, to write them. And one of the things we did was to look at the visibility of debate about tourism employment in the media during the pandemic. And it tripled. It went up by fold in key cities. And we included Madrid as one of our sample cities, looking at the national press in Spain. And in all countries, there was far more debate about the consequences of the pandemic for the workforce. And we thought, this is a new dawn. Things will get better. Suddenly, this will be taken seriously. It's like a flat balloon. It's gone. It's disappeared. It's disappeared, unfortunately. So what might travel and tourism work look like in 2030 and beyond? I think the work has always changed. So to say this is a new debate is not really a matter of reality. We've seen the way in which people are looking for work looking at work in a different way. I think it's moved that particularly younger people are looking at looking at working in order to live, rather than more traditional models of living in order to work. And I think employers will need to understand what their young people, all of us. I mean, I'm not a young person anymore. It's a couple of years since I had dark hair. But I'm looking for different things from work than perhaps my employers are willing to accommodate. I think employers need to do far more to embrace and understand what their workforce are looking for from work. And I think work will be, in the future, will be much, much more conditioned by what the workforce can deliver rather than what the market might want to give in terms of restaurant menus or whatever it is. Or even, and we're seeing this, certainly where I come from, we're seeing a lot of our cafes and restaurants closed on a number of days in the week because the workforce is not available to work in them. So challenging expectations of work and recognizing the place or the options for technology. And I'm not an expert on technology. We've got one of those guys sitting near the front here. But we hear a lot about technology or work and technology. We hear a lot about technology substitution. Well, we've heard about that for a long time. But we're seeing the emergence of work-based apps to help people find employment. We're seeing, obviously, the robotization of work. I don't really understand where AI fits into all of this. I'll leave that to more intelligent professors to explain that to me. And and technology plays a role in this whole process, undoubtedly. But how far will technology take us? There's evidence of some kickback against technology, perhaps among my generation, and some service providers are getting rid of, reducing their dependence on technology because their customers want to talk to people. I like talking to people. I don't like talking to machines, but anyway. But what we're faced with, and I'm only dipping into this, we're faced with going forward a lot of what we might call wicked problems in tourism. I was talking to Rachel Dodds, whom you'll hear later today, I think, and she said there's no such things as problems in tourism, didn't you, Rachel? Sort of. Well, I'm paraphrasing. There's only solutions or opportunities. I think there are problems in tourism employment, and I think they're structural, and I think they're so embedded that we have to work around them rather than necessarily to challenge them. AI represents a very good example of paradox, and AI and robotization. Huge opportunities, reducing labor costs, reducing labor skills and skills shortages, reducing low-quality jobs, improving service reliability, lots of benefits. Who wouldn't want it? Who wouldn't want to stay in an Ibis budget rather than a Ritz? And I think that's the issue. What does that mean for service? What does it mean for the authenticity of service, about the experience of the Canaries, the experience of Tenerife, if everything is just technology intermediated? I don't know. I don't have answers about that one, but I think as a tourism industry, we need to start to think about some of the consequences. So I don't really want to do this here because I'm conscious Eduardo is giving me looks. And I think coffee, 2 more minutes. You're very generous. What we've tried to do is try to vision what the future might look like. And we've written quite a bit about that. But one of the places that I've taken this conversation is to talk about sustainable human resource management, sustainable employment, and applying sustainability principles to employment in tourism. And that might give some of the answers. It means, I suppose it's looking at employment and employees through a different ethical lens than we might traditionally have done so. So I'm not going to go there in any depth. Ooh, this is exciting. But so what will work look like in 2023, in 2033? And that's not that far away. That's just it's the centennial of Orwell's book. That's why I use it. So we can envisage 2 different scenarios, or at least 2 different scenarios for the future. One is scenario 1, where nothing has really changed, where basically tourism work remains hugely diverse, but continues to be short-term orientated and includes low-pay, difficult working conditions, etc. Is essentially driven by consumers who continue to value cheap products and services without reference to their consequences. And we do that in other areas of consumerism, so why should tourism be any different? The big change one, which is the aspirational one, which we've tried to address, is where the industry embraces sustainability as part of a wider drive to address employment issues. Travel and tourism focuses on long-term workplace relationships, not necessarily always in the same business, but tries to build long-term relationships and facilitate long-term relationships with their employers. Areas of work are increasingly automated, but newer sustainable jobs emerge, and consumers value ethical and sustainable principles in the businesses with which they interact. Not only reusing your towel, but respecting the people who deliver the towel to the room. I think the narrative here in Spain of Las Kellys is something many of us can learn from. Just to promote something here, the Global Hospitality Research Association, if any of you are interested in finding a way forward as academics, although we welcome business partners as well. Last year we set up a group, relatively informal group, to address or to use hospitality and tourism employment research as a vehicle to drive change, to influence government policy, to influence employers. And it's an open community, and if anybody is interested in being part of this and is interested in this area of work, you're very, very welcome to join us and just have a word with me. So, I always finish this with this particular slide, because in this area, when you look at the future of work in tourism, there are far more questions than there are answers. And that's, in a way, what makes it interesting. If we knew all the answers, we just get the checklist, and then there really wouldn't be much to talk about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom. Amazing, different question that we want to give an answer. So, education, training, human research, technology. So, wow, we have many challenges in the future. Go ahead. So, one question, two questions. Before two, okay, Dimitrios.
Very quickly, quite often people are comparing walking tourism. So, very quickly, people compare walking tourism versus civil servant kind of public sector work. They never compare walking tourism with agriculture, with mining, with some of the jobs that are really much more difficult physically. And I don't think anybody is actually reminding people that there are other opportunities to go and work in other places, rather than some of the very civilized kind of places that they work in tourism.
That's an interesting thought, and you see that the competition between, you mentioned mining there, and as you know, my son is an engineer who's currently working in mining in Australia. And one of the big challenges in Western Australia is that the tourism industry is desperately short of staff, because anybody who graduates high school in Perth, for example, can get a job driving a truck or a dumper truck in the mines of Western Australia and earn about 4 times what they'd get if they went and worked in a local hotel. And so their whole lifestyle and their expectations, even if they don't do that for a long time, is built on the expectations of a lifestyle that's fed off a salary of 100,000 euros a year for doing an unskilled job. So yes, it might be tough, it might be nasty, but unfortunately the rewards in those extreme situations are such that it's very difficult to compete with. But yeah, it can be nice, it can be nasty as well. There's been a lot that's been written and published both in government reports and academic reports of the level of abuse and mistreatment in the tourism industry, particularly in hospitality, but not only. And there are interesting experiments going on. There's interesting things going on to address these. I mean, there's a well-known Irish airline which I think flies to Tenerife. I won't mention their name, but they've just bought off the plan 25 new houses in Dublin in order to close to the airport in order to accommodate staff. That may be the future. As hoteliers, as tourism businesses, you may need you build a hotel and you build staff accommodation. We used to do that. There are hotels in London which are reconverting rooms into staff accommodation in order to overcome things like the crisis. So, yeah, I mean, if you work in tourism, it can be the most wonderful job in the world. And we always talk about finding people with passion. And I love that word, passion. But the reality is there are only X thousand people with passion available to us. So we have to find a way of accommodating the less passionate. And I don't think you can train somebody to be passionate in that way. So, yeah. But thanks for raising that. Yes, there are a lot... But just because there are jobs which are a lot worse doesn't necessarily mean that what we're doing is okay.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Coffee is waiting. Coffee break. We will have a coffee break. Wait. Relax. We have the people here, so any question in the coffee, please. Coming back in 15 minutes to try to recover time, okay? See you in 15 minutes. Thank you. Right now, yes.